Hi, my name is Laura and this is my typeface called Anemone for Assessment 1 for DVB202. Let's start with the process. Part 1 is ideation, so after looking at the brief, which was to create a typeface with a minimum of 40 characters for the theme of symbiosis, I then brainstormed with the mind map to kind of narrow down my thinking because symbiosis is such a complex and broad topic. So I just thought of words that came to my mind when I was thinking about symbiosis and some examples there of some relationships too. So my next step was go, okay, cool, got a bunch of words from my mind map. What does this mean in terms of design decisions? So I've got some keywords there that I found were my most promising words from my mind map that we saw previously, and I've translated those into design decisions. So namely motifs and repeating elements and continuous lines, consistent line weight, wavy and curved shapes that capture movement as well. That's what I was looking for. And it really guided my creative direction, and that stayed with me throughout the entire process. The next step for me was to look for inspiration from other designers, and I actually used my design decisions to inform my search, because when I was initially looking for context and inspiration, I was looking for symbiosis, relationships, biology, nature-inspired fonts, and that's directly what I was typing into Google and Behance. And nothing much was coming up other than very leafy elements, very literal interpretations, and it just wasn't the vibe I was looking for. But I did come across these three beautiful designs. So in the top left we have Tenebras, which is an Art Nouveau inspired font. I love the strong use of motif in here. I love the tendril-like bars that are featured in here and how they contrast with the thick stems. To the right is a custom typeface for a French band. Very dreamy, love the A and the G, and again those tendril-like shapes, but I find the fact that it's a serif is a bit distracting, and to me it doesn't really match with those organic A shapes and the organic G in there as well. And then down the bottom is it's like a thick, it is very evocative, it's juicy, it's bold, but I really wish that the wavy elements in there were a little bit more cohesive. It does lend itself to the juicy, natural vibe, but I do wish they were a little bit more cohesive. Armed with some keywords, design decisions, and now some inspo from other designers, I was ready to make my mood board. So you can see that I was really inspired by mutualism, and especially clownfish and anemones, and lichen and its relationship with algae. And I knew that I really wanted to replicate those shapes. So very like tendril, tentacle, elegant, organic, but I also knew that I wanted them to be ambiguous as well. I wanted it to be open to interpretation. And I also wanted it to be multifaceted, so I wanted those shapes to be repeated throughout my typeface for a cohesive look that also kind of ties into the unity and the cooperation of symbiosis. And I also wanted integration, so a straight serif downstroke contrast with a rounded bowl. That's what I initially wanted, and I did have a really rounded bowl as an end result, but I didn't have a straight serif. I actually used those wavy shapes, but you'll see that later. And then at this point, I also wanted interconnected, and I wanted to initially do ligatures, but I eventually changed my mind because I felt like it didn't really match my font, and I also didn't want to overcomplicate what was already a steep learning curve. Now we're getting into the juicy part. So part 2, experimentation. So I started off with just hand-drawn on grid paper to ensure that my shapes were relatively consistent. I say relatively consistent. And I started with uppercase, and you can see some experimentation with the wavy motif in here as well. And then on the next slide, now we're moving into lowercase. And you can see here that I did a lot of variations of the same letter, and I really experimented here with different wavy elements. But I really became attached to the G, which you'll see in the next image there, and that's when I started to apply the same motif within the same character family. So I started with the round square elements first, and I moved those into Illustrator, but we'll talk about that on the next slide. At this point, I had begun digitizing those initial G, P, Q sketches, and then I basically just flipped them, transformed them a little bit, and then you've got B and D and P, like it's perfect. And then I just worked through the alphabet group by group based on shape. And you can see here on the left is basically documentation of all the experimentation I did for the letters and some of the numbers there as well. And then after that, I spent an eternity prepping my characters for FontLab. It was a very arduous process, but it really did pay off. Just when you think you have the perfect character, you copy and paste it into FontLab and it shows you this little red hotspot. And it's so humbling, and you just have to go back and forth, smoothing it out, pasting it in, and then doing that for every single character. Again, another long process, but it did pay off and you get a beautiful, smooth result. Cunning. This was a complete nightmare. Initially, I was looking for mathematical accuracy, but after some research, I discovered they are actually wanting what's optically correct, and it's an illusion. The first method that I use to create my kerning is volume visualization, and the idea is that the shaded areas should be equal-ish in area. The second method is more structured approach with guidelines, and then the third one there is trying to make your typeface as foreign looking as possible by blurring it, rotating it, transforming it, reflecting it, etc. I also used pangrams to ensure that I had a wide variety of letter combinations to ensure that my kerning was actually correct. And so you can actually see the difference between what I initially started with without kerning and then what I ended up with. I don't think that it's perfect. I think there is definitely space for some refinement, but I think I did a pretty good job for my first time. Moving on to design decision. This is Anemone in her full glory on the right. It's a sans serif unicase display typeface. I say display because I don't think it could be used for body text very effectively. I just don't think it would be as legible as, say, Futura. And it's sans serif because, like I mentioned earlier, I found serif to be a bit distracting, and it didn't quite tie into the organic nature that I was looking for. And it's unicase, but specifically lowercase for greater visual harmony. So I find uppercase can look a bit aggressive sometimes, and a mix of lower and upper wouldn't look as cohesive. And it really wouldn't imply mutualism and equality because uppercase is so much more authoritative and like domineering. The shapes in here are also ambiguous, so it allows for open interpretation. So any reader can look at it and go, maybe that's inspired by coral, maybe that's inspired by lichen, maybe it's supposed to represent water. I really wanted it to be open, but also undeniably organic, and I think that really enhances the symbolism of symbiosis in that it's complex and multifaceted. There is a geometric undercurrent to this as well that is partially unconscious because my two most used fonts are Futura and Century Gothic, both of which are geometric, and you can really see those influences in here, but the actual conscious decision behind it was the balance that circles provide visually and metaphorically. I also found the circles were really easy to just copy and paste elements to keep it cohesive. There's also a strong use of motif in here, so the repeating stems, bars, and loops were used again for cohesion, and cohesion in this font represents interdependence, unity, community, harmony, mutualism, all that symbiotic stuff. Okay, final reflection. The greatest challenge for me was kerning because of how time-consuming and the steep learning curve, and that it's really subjective. There's no hard and fast rules. The greatest strength in my typeface is definitely the symbolism. It's got a beautiful, strong creative direction from the start that evolved to become even more multi-layered over the design process. And as a designer, I'm so proud of my typeface. but I also recognize there's still so much to learn and it's not perfect. But the assessment has taught me not only typeface creating skills and not only typography knowledge, but it's taught me patience, design judgment. It's reminded me how important the details are and to trust the process, because if I had skipped any of the steps that I had done, I wouldn't have the same outcome. So I think that's also a life lesson as well. So I actually do really appreciate getting the chance to create such a beautiful assessment that I am so proud of and that has really contributed to my design growth and my career.